Hey, what's up, everybody? My name is Moss, and in this video, I want to demonstrate what the day-to-day activities might look like for a DevOps engineer, a platform engineer, a production engineer, a site reliability engineer, or a similar role who is using ChatGPT to enhance their productivity. So I see this video as a preview into the future of what a day in the life of a DevOps engineer or a similar role will look like when they have ChatGPT at their disposal. So similar to other day in the life videos, we'll start the day off by picking up a Jira story and then working on that Jira story. And while we're working on it, utilizing ChatGPT to enhance our productivity while working on that Jira story. And to summarize what I'm going to do in the video, I'm going to create basically a very simple Python service that's built using the Flask framework, and it's also going to use the Slack SDK to interface with the Slack API. And this service is going to accept a JSON payload that contains basically a Slack message, and the service will post that message to a channel. We're then going to containerize that application by creating a Dockerfile for it. And once we've created a Dockerfile, we'll then create a Kubernetes deployment and Kubernetes service for the built Docker image, and then we'll deploy that service to a Kubernetes cluster. We'll also create some very simple unit tests for the service. And for each step of the process, I'm going to be querying ChatGPT to assist me in building the Python application, and building the Docker file, in building the Kubernetes manifest, and also advising me on certain ways to set up my local development environment, and to also configure my project structure and things like that. There's definitely other features that I could add on, like monitoring and logging, and creating like a CI/CD pipeline as well. I'm going to leave those out for now, and if there's interest in a future video, I can expand upon this video and add maybe those features as well. And similar to this video, utilize ChatGPT to help me create those add-on features. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, a quick introduction to ChatGPT. If you haven't seen the ChatGPT interface, this is what it looks like. It's a very simple, easy to use interface, and basically you just type your questions into this field here, and ChatGPT will respond with an answer. So I'll be switching between this ChatGPT window and VS Code, where I'm connected to a virtual machine that's running on my computer. And that virtual machine is also connected to my Kubernetes cluster. And the Kubernetes cluster is running on a Raspberry Pi cluster. So I have 4 Raspberry Pis, and 3 of them are worker nodes, and 1 is the controller node. I also have a Slack workspace that I can administrate, and that Slack workspace is here. I have a channel called Alerts, and this is the channel that the service is going to post messages to. You can see I was already kind of testing things out and validating what I was going to do in this video beforehand. Let's go back to the chat window. So let's say it's the beginning of the day. You're a DevOps engineer or a site reliability engineer, and you have to pick up a new Jira ticket to work on for the day. And imagine that the Jira ticket basically says that as a user or as a member of the development team, I would like a service that is capable of programmatically sending a message to a Slack channel. So it's a very high level ticket, and the service could be used in a number of ways. So for instance, it could be used to send alerts about resource usage to a Slack channel, or maybe it just sends various events, like informational events, like a merge request in GitLab was merged, or a pull request in GitHub was merged, or a build failed in the CI/CD pipeline. The ticket didn't specify like what programming language to use to build the service, or any implementation specific details, which is good. That's the way a ticket should be written, unless there are some specific, technical requirements. And we know that Python is probably the most widely used programming language in the field of DevOps. Golang is also being used pretty often now, but I think that we can build a very lightweight service using Python. And since this is a web service, we should probably be utilizing some sort of web framework to help build the service. And I think Flask is probably a good choice in this case. I mean, we could query ChatGPT for its opinion on that as well. But I'm going to just move forward with Flask. Now, the other thing is we have to interact with the Slack API. So we need to our app needs to utilize a Slack SDK, the Python Slack SDK. So we'll make sure that our service utilizes the Slack SDK as well. Now, personally, I haven't worked with Flask very much. I'm not very familiar with Flask or how projects should be structured that are using the Flask framework. So this is something where I do want to query ChatGPT for and find out what would be the appropriate project structure for a Flask application. Okay, so if we take a look at what ChatGPT came up with, we can see that it provided a recommended directory structure for our Flask application with the project name and then the project package. Now, as I look over it, I realize that this application that we're creating is not going to have a UI. So things like the templates directory, the static directory are not necessary, but some of the other directories do look useful. So let's try to recreate this directory, and then even below the directory structure that it provides, it gives an explanation for each of the directories and each of the files in this project directory, which is pretty cool. And I can even ask ChatGPT to provide the commands to generate this project directory on my machine. So I'm going to say my project name is, I believe, Slack Message Service v2. Can you provide the commands to create this project directory structure? Okay. And I don't think we need views.py or models.py. I think we can leave that out. So I'm going to create some of these files and directories, but not all of them. So I'm going to go back in here and I'll create this directory and the init.py file. I'm not going to create a views.py or a models.py. I will create a app.py though. So let's do that. And the app.py is going to contain all of the code for this Flask application. We're going to make it as simple as possible. So I'm not going to create a templates directory or a static directory because, again, we don't have a UI for this web service. We don't really need that. And for this, I'm going to let's see, adjust test app.py. Okay. And so that looks correct. And then it actually suggests creating a virtual environment, which is really good. That would have been my next question after asking about a project directory structure. I would want to know how to set up the local development environment. So this is perfect. I'm going to create a virtual environment. And then I'm going to activate that virtual environment. The environment file, I don't think I'm going to create yet. I will create a requirements.txt file. And let's also create okay, so this is our Python project directory. Let's see. I'm not going to create a run.py file either. And let's see if this project directory structure works after installing Flask in our virtual environment. Okay, so we installed Flask, and I'm going to pull some code from the Quick Start Flask documentation and add it to our app.py. And let's just see, I'm curious to know how to run a Flask app. So how can I run my application? Okay, so here it's suggesting setting the Flask app environment variable to the run.py, but I have an app.py, and so I'm going to set it to Slack message service v2 app.py, and then let's try and do Flask run. Okay, so that looks like it works correctly. So it's invoking the app.py, and it's running a server that basically, when you connect to it, just says hello world. And it's running on port 5000. So I'm going to get rid of that boilerplate code, and let's go back to ChatGPT. And I want to instruct ChatGPT to generate a very simple Flask web service with a route called send message, and that will invoke a handler function that sends a message to a Slack channel. And I'm going to tell it to utilize the Slack SDK in order to connect to the Slack API, because when we try and write a message to the Slack channel, we have to authenticate with the Slack workspace. Okay, and let's see what ChatGPT comes up with. Okay, so let's take a look at the response that ChatGPT provided. So it imports the Flask framework. It imports the Slack SDK, which looks correct. And then it specifies a Slack app token, which we would need in order to authenticate with our Slack workspace. Here it specifies a channel, and then we'll have to replace that with the actual channel ID. And it correctly specified an app route called send_message. And it looks like it's getting the request from the client in JSON format, and then it attempts to post the message received by the client to the specified Slack channel. So far this is looking correct. And if I scroll down below the application code, it actually gives an explanation of the code. It says that it defines a route send message that accepts post requests, and when the client provides a JSON payload containing a message, the send message function is invoked. It even instructs me to replace the Slack app token with the actual token value. And this part I think is particularly cool. So it recognizes my Flask application is running on port 5000. It puts together a client request that is correctly formatted that I can send to my Flask application after starting it. And so I'm going to copy this to my clipboard. Well, actually, before I do that, I actually have to take this code and put it in our application. So uh, going back to VS Code, I'm going to paste that in. And I've already created a Slack application. I'm not going to walk through the steps of creating a Slack application. I have another video if you do want to review those steps. So if I pull up my Slack application, I've called it test ChatGPT. I'm going to pull the bot user token, and I'm going to go back to my application code, paste the token in, and then the channel ID I can actually pull from the URL of my Slack workspace. So I'm going to have this application posting to the alerts channel in my workspace. And if I go to back to VS Code, I'll update the channel ID, and we'll hard code this for now. I know it's a very bad practice to keep the token in. We should be pulling this from an environment variable, but for now I'll keep it hard coded. Okay, so I think that everything looks correct. And what I'm going to do next is run the application. And it says that I haven't installed the Slack SDK, so I'll need to do that. Pip install Slack SDK. All right, and now let's run the application. Looks like it's running correctly. And from a different terminal, I'm going to copy the client request here, and let's see if our application works correctly and it sends the message to the Slack channel. It says message sent successfully. Let's go ahead and check our Slack channel, and sure enough, it says hello from Flask. So it looks like our application code is working correctly, which is great. And it was able to produce that code almost immediately. Okay, so the next thing that I want to do now that I've kind of validated that the application code works correctly is write some small unit tests for this application. And let's see if ChatGPT can write these unit tests using the PyTest framework. So I'm going to go ahead and ask it to generate some tests. Okay, so if I scroll up to what ChatGPT generated, it is importing my my package and generated a few tests here. Test send message success, missing message, and then invalid token. The invalid token test is, a relevant test, but I don't think I'm going to keep that test. I think I'm going to remove that one and just use the missing message and message success one. The other thing that I don't like is that it's specifying the data attribute instead of the JSON attribute. So I'm going to ask it to regenerate the tests and also and remove the invalid token test, and then also replace the data attribute with the JSON attribute. Let's take a look at what it provided. So we have a couple of very simple tests here, and it did successfully update the data attribute to use just JSON, and it's hard coding the data here that it sends, the data payload that it sends. So I'm going to copy this and create a new file, or actually I think I already created the file. Let's see, test app, and we'll paste that in. And we need to install PyTest. So I'm going to do pip install PyTest. And then let's try to run these tests as they are right now. Okay, so I cut the video for a little while, and quite a bit of time elapsed because I started debugging the test failures, and ChatGPT kept coming up with kind of like circular answers every time I would ask it to fix the test script. So it ended up having quite a bit of trouble generating a working test script based off of my directory structure. So what I ended up doing to fix it is I actually provided ChatGPT with my current directory structure, and then I also gave it what was included um, in my app.py file, and I asked it to regenerate the test once it kind of knew the directory structure and knew how the code was structured as well. And after when it regenerated the test script this time, it made a very small change to the import statement of my package. It added a Slack message service underscore v2 dot app import app. So I was running into this issue where originally the test script just had from Slack message service v2 import app, and I was getting an error that said that uh, that app has no attribute test client. So this import statement was incorrect, and only after I provided, my project directory structure, the application code, was it able to generate a working test script. But to be honest, about I think like I don't know, I was debugging it for half an hour or more, trying to figure out what was missing and uh, why it wasn't working, because my expertise with Flask and PyTest is very, very high level already. So I really didn't have the expertise to understand what was going on. So after adding these test scripts to my local file system, it did start, the scripts did run successfully, and each test script passes. So we test that a message is missing when the client doesn't send a message. And then we also test message success. So it finally came up with the right answer, but it took quite a bit of time. In this particular case, when we were generating the test, ChatGPT was, um, I wouldn't say it was necessarily inefficient, because it was also an issue with the lack of knowledge that I have around PyTest and Flask. But now that we have working tests, I want to containerize the application. And so to do that, the first thing that I need to do is create a Dockerfile for the application. And I'm going to ask ChatGPT to generate a Docker file. Now, the thing about my specific environment is that I want to deploy this application to my Raspberry Pi cluster. So the base image should be a ARM64 compatible base image. So I'll tell ChatGPT to use a compatible base image for the ARM64 architecture. Okay, so let's take a look at the answer that ChatGPT gave. It looks like it's correctly pulling a Python base image with ARM64 v8 architecture. The version, though, is a little dated, so I'm going to update the tag to um, use 3.10 Python. So I'm going to ask it, can you update the tag of the base image to be 3.10.9 instead of 3.9-Alpine. Okay, and it looks like it cut off its answer, so I'm going to say, please finish your answer. and let's take a look at what it provided. So it correctly updated the tag for the base image. It switches the working directory to the app directory, which looks okay, copies the requirements.txt, and then installs the requirements.txt, or the dependencies from the requirements.txt, rather. It copies the application code and then exposes port 5000, which is what our application runs on, and then starts the application using Python module Slack message service v2.app, which is interesting. I wonder why it's doing that instead of using Flask run. Let's see what it provides in the text. Okay, it provides a command to build and run the image, which is nice. I guess this is okay. I mean, I'd prefer to stay consistent and have it run using the Flask command. Flask should be installed. So let me ask it to regenerate it. Okay, so interestingly, it doesn't add this environment line where it's specifying the Flask app, the location of the Flask app, but it just suggests that I can add that line myself. So I think I'd prefer if it just regenerated the Dockerfile to include the environment variable specification. Okay, so now it looks like it's utilizing the Flask command, running the application. It has the environment variable Flask app set. I think the entry point is correct as well. So if we transfer this this Docker file and the application code over to the target device, which is one of my Raspberry Pis, then we should be able to build this image. So I'm going to go ahead and SCP the this entire directory over. Okay, so SCP-R Slack message service v2, and then to RPI node 3 home pi. All right. Now the only problem with this is if I have to change application code or something like that. I mean, what I should be doing is uploading this as a Git repository to GitHub, and then from the Raspberry Pi, I can clone it down, and it will make it easier to synchronize changes if I have to change the application code and update it. But I'm not going to worry about that right now. I just kind of want to make sure that the Dockerfile is going to build an image successfully, and that we can still run the application and access it. Okay, so I'm going to SSH to my Raspberry Pi, and in here we're going to cd into the project directory, and I'm going to take a look at what it specified here. Oh, that's interesting. So I definitely should have created a Docker file before transferring it, but it's okay. I'll go ahead and touch a Docker file, vim Docker file. I guess I could have just done vim directly, but it's okay. And let's copy our Docker instructions, and that looks good. And then let's run the build command. And see if this works. Okay, so it looks like the image built successfully, which is good. Let's see if the application runs runs correctly, and we can still access it as a client and send requests to it as a client. So Docker run, we're going to expose it on port 5000, and okay, so it says Flask. Oh, okay, so since I don't have Flask installed on this Raspberry Pi, I should be using Python. So I'm gonna ask ChatGPT to regenerate. And let's see if it can regenerate the Dockerfile, but keep the environment variable command that we had in the most recent version of it. Okay, so it's interesting that it kind of took the very first copy of the Dockerfile, and it left out the environment command. But that's actually okay. And now that I think about that, because the environment variable was only needed for the Flask app itself. So when the Flask was run, Flask application was run from the command line. So let's go ahead and update the Dockerfile in our Raspberry Pi. Actually, I'm just going to Dockerfile and Vim. And let's see if we can rebuild the Dockerfile. And then we'll try and run it. Now, one thing that I'm curious to know is if the requirements has anything listed in it. I don't know if it's been, yeah. So the requirements.txt is empty because I didn't do a pip freeze, I believe, and add the dependencies to the requirements.txt. So let me go ahead and do that. Pip freeze requirements.txt. Okay, I was in the wrong directory, so I just needed to freeze in the correct directory. I wrote to requirements.txt file one directory level above. So let's go back to our Raspberry Pi, and inside of a Raspberry Pi, I'm going to append the requirements to the requirements.txt, all of our dependencies, okay? And then let's rebuild the Docker image. This time it should install the requirements. And I wonder if the Flask, like now that I have the requirements, which include the Flask application, I wonder if I could utilize the version of the Dockerfile that had an entry point running the Flask client. Okay, and I'm going to try and run the application now. Let's see what happens. Okay, it looks like it works. So from a different terminal, I'm going to copy this command. Whoops. I'm going to copy our client request, and I'm going to SSH onto the same Raspberry Pi node, so that we're on localhost. And it doesn't look like that worked. I think that the reason that this doesn't work is probably because the Flask application is binding to the loopback address, and it's not. I don't think that it's binding to 0.0.0, which would enable it to be accessible. Would enable the Flask application to be accessible by a client on the Raspberry Pi node. So I think if I go to the application code and modify it, I can do something like this. Host equals 0.0.0.0. I'll try this and see if that works. So I'm going to cd into and let's modify this. Whoops. Let's rebuild our application. And I'm going to run the application. Oh, and that's probably an issue. You know what I just noticed as well? It says running on one on the loopback address, which is what I suspected, that it was running on the loopback address, but inside of the container, which means that the application and the server can't receive requests from a client outside of the container. So let's see if running on this. Okay, now you can see running on all addresses 0.0.0. It's running on the loop. It's listening on the loopback address, but it's also listening on the container's IP address. So now, as a client, we should be able to run this curl command, and I think this curl command will work. But let's see. And it says message sent successfully. So let's check the alerts and see if it works. And yeah, sure enough, it says hello from Flask, and it just sent a message. So that's awesome. So we know now that we have a working Docker image. I have a private registry that's running in this cluster, so I will need to tag it, and I have a kind of ugly setup with this private registry. I'll have to tag the image and push it to that registry so that what we do next will work correctly. So after creating an image for our application, the next thing I want to do is deploy our image, deploy our application to the Kubernetes cluster. And to do so, the worker nodes need to have access to the image. They're going to pull the image from my private registry, and we also need to create Kubernetes manifest files for a deployment and a service for our application. And to generate those manifest files, I'm going to utilize ChatGPT. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the service. And exit the Raspberry Pi node. So I'm going to go back to ChatGPT, and I'm going to request that it create a Kubernetes deployment and service for this application, for this Flask application. Okay, so let's take a look at its answer. Right off the bat, it separates out the deployment and the service, and I'd like it to be combined. The other thing, it only has one replica. I think that it should have multiple replicas because, why? I don't know. I mean, unless it's like a stateful application, why only have one replica? That doesn't really make sense. So looking at everything else, I think that it looks okay. The other thing that I'd like to change is that the service type is cluster IP. but that means that I can't access the service outside of the cluster, which is what I want to do. I want to send a client request from like my virtual machine to the Raspberry Pi cluster and be able to access this service. So I want the service to be of type node port, which will expose a port on all of the worker nodes that will then be routed to the service. So I'm going to ask it to combine the deployment and service definitions into a single manifest file, and then two, update from cluster IP to node port for the service. And then the last thing is update the replicas to 3 replicas. Okay, and it looks like it cut off the answer, so I'm going to say, please continue your answer. Okay, let's take a look at the updated manifest file. And it updated the replicas correctly. It's updated the service to node port, but what I noticed here is I don't know if it's actually specifying the port on the node that that will be accessible. So I think that this is actually an error here because it's not. So here it does say node port service type assigns a specific port on each node of your cluster to the service. So you need to make sure that the port you choose is available, but it's not specifying the port in the definition, and I want it to. So this is kind of, I think that I would have expected it to actually add the port on the node and specify that that port in the service definition. So I'm going to ask it to recreate the manifest file, and I'm going to also rename the manifest file. Okay, so this time it correctly added the node port to the service definition. And the last change that I need to make is the image name here. I need to tag this image, one, push it to my private registry that's hosted in my cluster, but then also tag it with the repository name as well. And I'll need to update the image name in this manifest as well. So I'm going to reconnect to my Raspberry Pi where I built the image. And I'm going to use the docker tag command to tag the image that we created up here, Slack message v2, Slack message service v2. And I'm going to tack on the IP address of the private registry. I know this is not an ideal configuration, but I just kind of hacked it together quickly. Let's see. Okay, yeah, I don't really like the v2s here, but I'm gonna just leave it for now. And then we are going to do a Docker push to that registry. And let's see if this works. So I reused, just a kind of side note, because I had kind of went through this process before and validated it, it reused some layers that from a different image that had the same service on it. So that's just kind of interesting. So it successfully pushed the image to my private repository, and I've configured my worker nodes to pull from that private repository in the cluster as well. So what I need to do is have ChatGPT update the manifest file with this image. So let's go ahead and do that. And it looks like I just need to reconnect to the service. Okay, I'm going to ask it to please continue its answer. Okay, so this manifest I think should be correct. I think this will work, but let's go ahead and create a manifest file in our repository. So I'm going to create a new file in the root directory of the project's root directory. And we'll call it what it was called here. I don't remember what the manifest was called. Yeah, Slack message service.yaml, and we will paste that in. And then let's use, I'm reconnecting to my virtual machine, and let's use kubectl apply -f for file, Slack message service.yaml. Before I do that, I just want to make sure that I don't have any conflicting services from when I was experimenting earlier. Okay, so I just have the registry running, which is good. And let's see if it successfully pulls the image and runs the image. Okay, 1's ready, 2's ready, 3's ready. All right, that's good. Now let's take a look at the pods and see if there's any problems. Okay, it says that they're all running, which is good. So if I take a look, let's see. All right, it says that the container is started, so that's good. Now, since this service is running as a node port type service, I should be able to connect to it using one of the Raspberry Pi's IP addresses, and then this node port, which is going to get forwarded to the exposed port 5000 in the container that's running on the Raspberry Pi. So let's see if I can copy the client command. Don't remember where that was. Okay, so this was the client command. And I'm going to real quickly check the IP address of the Raspberry Pis. So let me do kubectl get pods-o wide. That's not correct. I want these are the cluster IPs, I believe. Okay, I got the IP address of one of the Raspberry Pis, and I'm going to replace localhost with the address of one of the Raspberry Pis that should be running the service, but it shouldn't matter which Raspberry Pi I select because it's a node port service. It will get, the request will get proxied to whichever worker node is actually running the Slack message service. And we're going to update the node port to be 30,081. And it looks like it worked, which is Awesome. Sure enough, we have a message that was posted just now to the channel, and it looks like our service and deployment worked correctly, and our application is now containerized and scalable since we created a Kubernetes service and deployment for it. So of course we could expand this to include GitOps, create a CI/CD pipeline for a GitLab or GitHub, or maybe a Jenkins pipeline. I'm not going to expand it any further. Obviously, we could add monitoring, we could add a CI/CD pipeline to this, and utilize ChatGPT for each of those steps. But I think through what I've demonstrated in the last few activities, you can really see the power of ChatGPT and where its limitations. Some of its limitations are it is pretty accurate most of the time, but then some of the time it just won't produce a working piece of software or working configuration. I think the best example of that was when creating the tests. I think it took about half an hour to figure out what was going on. It did finally come up with a solution, but I couldn't depend on any of my own expertise when working with Flask or PyTest. I just don't work with those tools often enough. Whereas when it comes to like Kubernetes and Docker, I have a little bit more familiarity. And if there was issues from what was produced from ChatGPT, I was able to I would be able to troubleshoot them a little bit easier. In my opinion, I think that the technology behind ChatGPT is going to completely change the way uh, people work, especially DevOps engineers. I think a lot of day-to-day activities for a DevOps engineer, you're looking up documentation, small bits of code or configuration, and a lot of it is syntactical, and you can't just memorize all of the syntax for these tools like Kubernetes and Docker. They're really complex tools. They have a lot of different features. And I think that ChatGPT fills this gap where you don't necessarily need to remember everything, all of these basic syntax and basic boilerplate configurations and code. What we created here was basic. The application was simple. The tests were simple. The Dockerfile was simple. The Kubernetes manifest, all of it was a very basic setup. And I don't think that if our application was a lot more complex and a very large application, I don't think that ChatGPT would be able to help you as much. But for small tasks like this, where you're just creating maybe one-off automation scripts or one-off applications or small services, I think ChatGPT can be extremely effective in increasing your productivity. So I've been enjoying it a lot. I've also been learning a lot while I use ChatGPT, because I can basically ask it any questions. Like if I'm not familiar with, how to search for something, uh, search for a resource in Kubernetes, I can ask ChatGPT to give me a command that will allow me to see various information about a pod or something like that, and it will return the command. I don't have to go through searching through Docs or searching through Google, and I think that that is going to change the way we work. I've been considering making this video a part of a series where I continue to expand on essentially what I've been doing here, and maybe in a separate video I expand this application and add monitoring and logging functionality to the application, and utilizing ChatGPT, also creating like a CI/CD pipeline using ChatGPT. If you're interested in seeing more of these types of videos, please let me know in the comments. And if you have any thoughts about ChatGPT in general, if you've been using it, how have you been using it? Have you also been kind of using it to assist you at work, or to learn? Because personally, I've been using it to learn tools that I've been kind of uh, intimidated by to research and dive into, because I know it's going to take a lot of time. It's going to have a steep learning curve, and ChatGPT has kind of removed some of that anxiety that I have about learning new tools. So let me know if you have any feedback or comments or questions. Please let me know in the comments below. And again, if you want to see more of this kind of video, if you want me to make this part of a series and I add additional things to this particular setup, please let me know in the comments. Thanks a lot for watching.